on the road.
All right, our first session is our newly diagnosed session. And our presenters are?
Our presenters are Kristy Taylor. She actually lives in Las Vegas. She's a co-leader of the Vegas Ataxia group, and she's an advocate for ataxia awareness and clinical trial participation. Her full bio is on page 20, so if you want to read more about Kristy, you can do that. And then also we have Dr. Oguh with us, and she's a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic Ruvo Center.
There you go.
And she has her medical degree from Szeged Facility or Faculty of Medicine in Hungary. So if you want to read more about Dr. Oguh, she's on page 19 in your programs.
There you go. And be sure to send your questions in through Chime Live. And let's get on with it. Here we go.
Here we go. Let's get this show on the road.
Yes. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to present here today. Kristy and I, we are doctor and patient, and we collaborate a lot in a lot of things. And I met Kristy, I think 2 years ago now, or 3. I think it was right during the pandemic, actually. I moved to Vegas from the University of Florida 3.5 years ago, so I have been a movement disorder now for more than 15 years, and just currently with the Cleveland Clinic here in Las Vegas for the last 3.5 years. So thank you for allowing me to speak. So today we're gonna go through what I think you should think about when you are a newly diagnosed patient. I think we hear a lot when patients come into the room is you don't get told anything after you get diagnosed. They don't do anything and nothing changes. It's some of the discussion points that I often see with our patients when they come into the room. So that being said, let me see if I can operate this. Good. I have nothing to disclose or relationships to list at this time. So when you do get diagnosed, what am I diagnosed with? And when we do know with ataxia, as a general definition, it is a combination of symptoms that are progressive due to a deterioration or a decline of the cerebellum and its connections. And symptoms of cerebellar ataxia are often in maybe 3 major categories: motor symptoms, vestibular symptoms, and cognitive and sometimes psychiatric manifestations. When we talk about motor symptoms, I think we often think about the impaired walking, I walk like I'm drunk, poor balance and falls. We think about clumsy hands and feet, slurred speech, stiffness and even swallowing problems can be some of the symptoms that we do see. Vestibular symptoms include dizziness or vertigo. Most of the time, dizziness and vertigo are what we call more centrally located, so you're always dizzy all the time or have this feeling of being off balance. So that's much more of a central symptom, although sometimes we can have peripheral symptoms with vertigo where can be triggered by movement, which differentiates sort of that peripheral from central vertigo is the fact that there's truly no triggers for central vertigo. It happens all the time. We can have visual symptoms, and this include blurred vision, double vision, or jumping vision, which is also called nystagmus, when your vision sort of jerks and jumps around. So these are some of the vestibular symptoms that we do see. Go back one. Cognitive and mood changes a lot, and listed all of them here. But usually what we do see, I think the most common is anxiety, irritability, depression are the most common mood symptoms. Anger, irritability are very common in our patients. Emotional dysregulation, so you can go from being very, very high and bright and light, and then you're down again. So that emotional variability is something that's very common in ataxia as well. Some of the cognitive changes come with executive functioning. Executive functioning is sort of that high level of functioning. Things that have to do with judgment, reasoning, motor planning. For example, I know that I'm supposed to take my walker to walk down to the kitchen, but I don't do it, so I don't plan that motor activity because I feel that I can do it, but instead leads to falls. Sometimes language can be some difficulty as well in the early stages of ataxia. So again, when we talk about some of the other features of ataxia, sometimes are much more dependent on what type of ataxia you have, whether you have overlap of Parkinsonism symptoms, overlap of neuropathy, presence of seizures, as some of the things that we might see in some specific types of ataxia. So when we kind of differentiate them based on neurodegenerative ataxias, we talk about the genetic ataxias as well as sporadic ataxias. The genetic ataxias perhaps have been researched a lot, which are the autosomal dominant ataxias, meaning one of my family, my parents have it and I get the gene, but you can also have that striking lightning event where one person in the family gets a dominant gene due to a spontaneous or de novo mutation, and then that starts the cascade of inheritance in the family. Recessive genes are typically what we see. No parents have the disease itself, but are carriers of the gene, and so that gets transmitted at a 25% chance to the offspring. But we also can have recessive ataxias that are also de novo mutations, and those are the ones that often begin sort of that late onset, late stage type of ataxia. X-linked and mitochondrial ataxias are also other types of genetic ataxia. So in terms of the sporadic or idiopathic, and I take that definition with a little bit of a misnomer because we don't know what's causing the ataxia at the moment. With the advances in genetic testing, with the advances in testing for these genes, I think we will find what's causing the ataxia as time goes on. And usually that, as I mentioned, some of that late onset cerebellar ataxia and also something called multisystem atrophy. The cerebellar type sort of goes into this idiopathic or sporadic ataxia. And we never really talk about some of the symptomatic or secondary types of ataxias, which are usually caused by something else, either by stroke or drugs or medication sometimes can trigger this. So as a clinician, we're going through all this, making sure we're excluding any triggers, we're excluding anything that can be causing this. So when you then get diagnosed, newly diagnosed, and once the diagnosis is given, what are the next steps? What am I left with? And I think this is the main course of our talk today, is to sort of define what are the next steps once I get this diagnosis. And I think the biggest thing is education, educating yourself. We do have a lot of people who go to Google, but finding that resources on the internet can be difficult because sometimes Google doesn't give you the latest information. They may give you an information, and sometimes I get patients in my office and say, am I going to die tomorrow since I have this diagnosis? And the answer is no. So what does that really mean for you? So informing yourself is very important. Verting your sources of information. And what are some of the sources of information you found helpful is also very important as well. Do you receive written information? I tend to try to give written information in the office, but it could be so overwhelming when you get that diagnosis and I'm talking to you about the elements of the disease and you're trying to take down notes. And that is just overwhelming. And I often say to the patient, I can see you in 6 weeks. I can see you a little bit closer. I'm sure by that time you will digest some of this information and have a lot of questions for me. We can communicate that way as well. Because again, when you get the diagnosis first time in the office, it can be so overwhelming to vert which information should I be digesting at this time. I often refer to the patient always to the National Ataxia Foundation. There's a wealth of information there. The National Institutes of Health has a wealth of information there on specific types of ataxias. So those are the usual branches of information I often offer the patient. And once you found that information, how do you harness it? How do you use it is also very important. So as I said, the ataxia community, the National Ataxia Foundation, your local ataxia support groups, other patients, other caregivers are ways to also vert and get information as well. So once you understand or get this information, understanding yourself is also very important. How do you best want to receive care? I think in the medical community, we are often versed with the task of access to care. Access to that academic care is often very difficult. Finding a local neurologist that is going to be able to give collaborative care is also very difficult. The National Ataxia Foundation has done a great job of trying to find those resources in your local community that would be best for you. Helping yourself is also so important. So again, how do you want to receive that care? I do have some patients who stay with their local neurologist, and I just offer a collaborative once every 6 months type of care, and together we're able to help the patient. With the advent of telemedicine, that could be another option as well. Using that to harness care in academic centers can also be helpful. So finding that support, finding that resource is also important. So the next thing we're going to talk about is research. And that's the way you can also support, that's the way you can also give to yourself. I know Kristy does a lot of research, and sometimes in our local community, we may not have the research available, but referring to places that have research, if that is accessible to you, is a great idea. I often say we can't advance in therapies, we can advance in care of ataxia without supportive research, or even understanding how far we've come in terms of understanding the disease. We can do that without research. And research comes in many ways. Observational studies, natural history studies are very important. I have certain patients who do observational studies with places as far as Australia, where they can do that type of research over the internet, over the phone. And so those are ways to get involved without actually being involved in interventional therapies. And when I talk about interventional therapies, I talk about drug therapies, which we are doing as well to help treat certain types of ataxia. Clinicaltrials.gov, the best place to look for trials at this point, and that's the resource I usually send to my patients if they're looking for trials that are not in my local community, but could be elsewhere they can participate in. So again, support is so important. Social support. Kristy is also a community leader involved in supporting the ataxia support groups in Las Vegas. And so that support is so important. The best person to learn from is another patient. Even though sometimes I help in teaching, but I think with the patient, that's the best person. They can share their learned experiences and help support you through this journey. A member of any support group can be helpful. So maintaining those connections are so crucial when you get diagnosed, to understand the disease, to see how other people live with the disease. I met a patient over the course of this journey, and she said to me, yes, you have so much brain. So how do I harness that brain despite the fact that I have ataxia. It was my goal through my entire life. She was diagnosed at 7 or had symptoms at 7 and is now in her 80s, and she's done everything, including has a black belt in kickboxing, and I don't do that. But again, you can see that there's so much you can do despite the diagnosis. So multidisciplinary approach to treatment is key. I often say all ataxias are treatable. Some ataxias do have specific treatments. Knowing the cause of ataxia informs what type of treatment we can offer, and treatment is tailored to individual needs. So that multidisciplinary team approach is so important in the treatment of ataxia. So that care team could look as simple as just your neurologist, your rehab specialist, your psychologist, and depending on the type of ataxia, whether you have a cardiologist, a sleep doctor, ophthalmologist, could be helpful as well. So the interdisciplinary team, if you're engaged in research, is also very important as well. There are ways to reach out to research, as I said, clinicaltrials.gov, the National Ataxia Foundation, are all ways to reach out for research. National Institutes of Health are also important ways to reach out to research. I want to bring up palliative care, mostly because a lot of people don't know about palliative care, and I think it has sort of got a bad connotation in our community because it is a branch of hospice. But I usually encourage palliative care in patients who are having difficulties getting out of their home. Medicare covers for this, so you can utilize this as a way if it's difficult getting out of my home, it's difficult getting just my basic care needs. Palliative care can be an option, and it can be in form of advanced care planning, it can be in form of home health, it can be in form of therapies that come into your home, and you can also have a palliative doctor that comes in. And again, the palliative care doesn't mean you don't have that connection with your neurologist. You can still have that connection with your neurologist, but your basic care needs are met by palliative care since it's becoming a little difficult just getting out of the home. So again, that's something I always broach when patients are advancing. It's difficult getting out of their home as a means to sort of provide that basic care. So your multidisciplinary team can look like this. It can look as a version of, having a neurologist all the way to having a palliative care team, but that multidisciplinary care should suit what your needs are. And I think that that's really the goal of ataxia care moving forward. So I think I'm gonna stop here and have Kristy video up, and so that we can proceed from that.
A lot of people have asked me for my story. I was not ready to share it or explain it before. How could I explain something that I myself did not fully understand or come to terms with yet? Ataxia presents differently in different people. This is my story. When I was first diagnosed with ACA-10 in the year 2013, I was in shock and disbelief. Being raised by a single parent with ataxia and having other family members with it, I was somewhat familiar with it. When the doctor called me the diagnosis, I cried. And then I decided to disregard it and go about life and bury it in the back of my head. Over the next 3 years, I started to notice it was slowly becoming more difficult to do physical things, especially walking, so I was going out less. ended up buying a fold-up cane, which I would take out with me sometimes. I would use it to help me get wherever I was going. I would quickly fold it up, stuff it away in my purse. I was so embarrassed to use any kind of aid to help me get around. Around the year 2016, some people started asking me why I walked the way I do, and some so-called friends even made jokes or making fun of me. I used to model, and in the year 2016, I remember not being able to walk to the set. Most photo shoots require high heel shoes, so all I can think was, how am I gonna do that? I can't. And it was at this point I thought it was all over. Everything I had been building up. I had to go back to a desk job, which I did. I had an office at first, and then as the years passed, I took jobs where I could work out of my home office, because working at home, I was able to preserve energy, but I ended up earning less. Most people in my life were still completely unaware. I felt like I did not want to bother them with my problems. In the beginning of fall 2019, I accepted a position working from my home. That position was mainly on the computer and phone all day long. At the end of the first day back to work after the New Year's holiday, I had just finished the workday, logged out. I got a dreadfully odd feeling. It felt like I was in danger. I started to go up the stairs where my husband was. I didn't make it all the way up the stairs. I remember waking up to paramedics calling my name, people around me, and I was on the ground. I vaguely remember being loaded into the ambulance, being taken to the ER. I was going in and out of consciousness. I was not really awake during the majority of the time, but they did manage to stabilize me. They released me and told me to go back to my neurologist. My husband drove me home. I remember being super tired, brushed him away and let him know I had to sleep. I slept alone downstairs. My husband found me in the morning on the ground. Apparently, I had more seizures over the rest of the night. My husband took me back to the hospital. Once I was stabilized, finally the hospital did give me seizure-controlled medication when they released me. I know quite a bit of people with ataxia, and the majority of them do not have seizures. It was at this point I realized I waited too long and I needed to learn more about ataxia. After that, I went on short-term disability leave from work for about 6 months. I also signed up on the NAF mailing list and also on the CORD registry to learn more about what clinical trials were going on. I remember being nervous going to my first clinical trial appointment. I also remember having a huge feeling of comfort, finally being somewhere I did not have to explain myself. I continued to sign up for more trials. This gave me a huge sense of relief. I felt like I was doing something about my ataxia and contributing to the potential discovery of new treatments and hopefully soon a cure. Participating in the trials gave me access to some of the best doctors who specialize in dyslexia. With every visit, I continue to learn more and more about ataxia, and most importantly, how to manage it. Learning how to manage it made it a lot less scary and much more comfortable. 6 months later, my short-term disability was over. I had to return to work. I still wanted to work. At the same time, I realized I could not realistically do it full-time anymore. I had a discussion with my doctor, got the papers for me to return to work part-time only. Towards the end of my shift each day, after speaking 4 hours straight, I could barely maintain my speech. Customers would often ask me to repeat myself. At the end of every call, I also had to type out and log a full report. I started to notice that typing also took longer than it used to. About 9 months later, management let me know that my metrics did not meet the requirement. I pointed out the fact that my doctor had sent in the form informing them I have a disability, yet there was simply no understanding. I ended up leaving the phone call frustrated and in tears. All of my anxiety came back like a tidal wave. I could not sleep well, therefore I was falling a lot, constantly getting hurt. I was in a very dark place. All I wanted to do was disappear. I continued to participate in clinical trials and see my neurologist on a regular basis. When the short-term disability was coming to an end, I had another discussion with my neurologist. We agreed that it would be best to not return to work. I filed for long-term disability with my employer, and I also obtained a lawyer who specializes in disability benefits. I reluctantly applied for disability income. I was still not quite sure what to do with myself. Some friends of mine and my husband suggested I get back involved with modeling, to which I replied, yeah, right. They also said, well, you never know unless you try. And I thought for a second, I said, okay, well, I can't really argue that logic. So I went ahead and created some accounts online. To my surprise, some people actually responded. Thank you for following along. And yes, it was definitely a bit difficult in the beginning. However, with the actions I took eventually got me to a better place mentally, and I learned that I was a lot stronger than I thought I was. So for any of you who may feel frustrated or in the dark, you're definitely a lot stronger than you think you may be. The main thing I want to do is to pass down some of the information I learned on how to manage ataxia to people who are newly diagnosed. So I really appreciate your attention and your time today. Thank you so much. Bye.
That's awesome.
Dr. Oguh, I want to thank you for the presentation. Such great information that you shared with our ataxia folks. Really great information. And Kristy, I want to thank you for your very inspirational story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh. I know how much it took for you to share that. It was a well done.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best with everything you got going on. And you know what? It just goes to show that this disease doesn't have to stop us, right?
Absolutely. No surrender.
Absolutely.
No surrender.
No surrender. So well done. Sorry for the tears. I just get very emotional. All right, so at this point in the program, I want to say, if you would like to submit questions, I just want to remind you that on page 17 in your program, directions for how to submit questions. Logging into Chime On Live and submitting your questions will allow us to ask questions of both Kristy and Dr. Oguh. We don't have any virtual questions, but we do have Laurie, who has a microphone. And so if anyone in the audience has a question, just raise your hand and we can get Laurie to go over to you with her microphone. So we're going to open it up for questions. We have a question over there, Laurie, in the corner.
It's okay. Thank you. You're sweet. I've seen you around. Yeah, my husband is Ataxia. Yeah, so, yeah. I'll talk later. Okay.
About
Hello?
palliative care. So recently I was taking care of my mother, and towards the end they suggested palliative care, and they told me that once the palliative care starts, other types of medical things will stop. Like they won't look into if you have some sort of other disease.
Power's on.
Okay. If you have some sort of other disease, if you got COVID, anyhow, the palliative care minimizes your other medical care. That's what I found out. And I wanted to ask you if that's the case, and maybe tell a little bit more about that.
That's not my recollection of how palliative care is. So there are two ways you can go for palliative care. And when I talk about palliative care, sort of for those chronic neurodegenerative diseases, oftentimes you can, if I refer you for palliative care, for example, I can check on that palliative care form, I still want to be involved with the care, and the palliative doctor does all the rest of the care. So it can be a collaborative type of care versus sort of just shipping everything to the palliative care doctor and say, take care of this. So I'm not sure, that's not how my recollection is, unless they talked about more hospice care, which is when the hospice doctor takes over, which is very different. And I always want to make sure when the neurologist suggests a palliative care, that neurologist sending that referral and making sure that they're checking what exactly they want for that palliative care. Because again, with palliative care, I'm not saying, okay, person is going to pass away in 6 months. This could be years, but offering that continued collaborative approach to palliative care is what we usually do. So unless they had changed it to hospice care in between or something, but usually palliative care doesn't mean that you stop seeing your neurologist. Typically what tends to happen, you can still see the neurologist and you can check, you still want to be involved in that care. So it might depend on how that referral was initially sent, is my thought. Does that answer your question?
Hello? Not totally. So the question is, a person who gets palliative care, I'm assuming, would then be also entitled to other sorts of medical care that would go towards healing any other ailments or even, somatic circumstances. Is that right?
Yeah, you should be able to get COVID treatment, for example, if the patient has COVID or things like that. So it shouldn't stop their general care.
Not just comfort care, but actual healing care.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you could still take whatever ataxia medications that your doctors have prescribed. So it doesn't stop, all the medications that your neurologist has prescribed.
Hi. I was diagnosed 11 years ago, and when my first experience going to the neurologist locally in my town, he was very unknowledgeable about ataxia in general. So I've had to go down to Philadelphia, which is about 2 hours away, and recently moved to Florida, and I drove 2 hours to Tampa to see a neurologist, trying to find a neurologist more close to where I live. But it seems like I can't tell by looking at the bio of the neurologist if they have any experience really in ataxia, and I don't really want to waste my time going to see a doctor who's not real familiar. Do you have any advice? Because I'm sure this is probably the case for, I've heard this in other support groups from other people.
That is very true. So the National Ataxia Foundation, they do have a list of clinics on their websites that they have vetted and known that they do have an ataxia clinic. So ataxia, certainly the care, whether it is just a local neurologist, could be poor. I think that's the feedback I get from a lot of our patients. I think the best way might be, number one, to look for a fellowship-trained movement disorder physician. If they're a movement disorder physician, we all get training in ataxia. Then finding that person who's researching ataxia could be that extra visit where you go and see them every 6 months or so. But having that local movement disorder, and even movement disorder physicians, we're hard to find. It's difficult sometimes just to find someone who's fellowship trained. But I think it's hard. I agree, it's hard to find someone who, when you look on their website, do they treat ataxia? Maybe not. But if they're general neurologists, the answer is that they just treat everything. So they're not going to have that framework for ataxia. If they have a fellowship-trained movement disorder physician, they will have some knowledge of ataxia, certainly the care of ataxia patients, and having that subspecialty care, someone who's researching ataxia could be a bonus on that. But all movement disorder physicians who are fellowship trained all have access to ataxia care.
We had a couple of questions come in through our virtual platform. And so I have 2 questions specifically for you, Kristy.
Oh.
One is from Terrence Dunn, who says, "Many thanks for the inspirational story.
Oh.
What did you do to improve your speaking? You sound great."
My speech, thank you. Well, my speech fluctuates, so sometimes it can sound clear, and then sometimes not so much. I'm in the Biohaven study at UCLA with Dr. Perlman. I did notice a little bit of an improvement with my speech after I started the trial. Okay. Not much, but a little bit. No, I'll take whatever I can get.
Exactly.
Yes.
And do you notice, I'm just curious, if your speech worsens if you're tired?
Yes, 100%.
That's a common thing I hear as well.
Yes.
Thank you. Another question is from Maria Hajar. What could be a quote you would give people who have to live with ataxia to encourage them? So
That quote that was up. Once you realize you have strength, what does it say? It said, once you realize you have power over your thoughts and not the situation. The quote that was up on the screen, not the situation, you can control your thoughts and your mind. Then you gain strength.
Yes. Thank you.
And I might add with the speech therapy, I think you've done some of that as well.
I did some, yes.
But usually, with the speech therapy, it's a little bit different from other types of therapy, where in speech therapy for ataxia, you want to have them speak a little bit slower, enunciating the words a little bit better. Certainly when you're speaking faster, I think that's when the slurredness comes in. So just taking your time with your words are usually some of the techniques the speech therapy will use is slow enunciating that word process. And a lot of the slurred speech had to do with how your tongue moves as well. So doing exercises to strengthen that tongue movement could also be helpful.
Yeah.
I think I like that quote that says, "No surrender." I think that's an awesome quote as well.
Yeah, no surrender.
It definitely is. We also have a question from Drew Ritter. He actually has a couple. When you went for long-term disability, did you find it was challenging to get ataxia recognized as a disability? And what was the main challenge that required a lawyer to help with that?
So with my employer, my doctor signed the documents required for them to know I have a disability. But I'm not sure if he's referring to your employer or getting government like benefits, like income. The reason I got a lawyer, I thought it was quicker. But honestly, you could just do it on your own. Just apply yourself and do it on your own because they take a portion of the money. So unless they deny you and have trouble doing it and getting approved, do it yourself. That way you get the money. But yeah.
Yeah, terrific.
I think we're also long-term, it's just being knowledgeable on how to sign those forms, because sometimes it's all based on language, unfortunately, with our system. So just sort of understanding what language to put in those forms could be helpful, for the patient, because they're not going to take ataxia without understanding what ataxia is and actually explaining to the person who's reading in a 5th grade level language what ataxia is also so important.
Yeah, and Dr. Oguh, just from my own personal experience, I find that having another person in the room is very helpful in those situations.
Correct.
Because it's another person hearing that information at the same time.
Correct.
Lori, do we have another question in the room?
Yep.
Okay.
I think there's one right up front here.
Okay. Oh, I think I know that guy.
I think so too. A little bit.
Do you find that you manage your day by the clock?
Me? No, by my energy level. Depends on how much energy I have. I'll do whatever depending on my energy level because I do get fatigued.
So that being said, so I'm going to rephrase the question. You kind of plan your day out, so you find that you're probably not going to go full force and do things in the morning if you have things later on in the day, because then it affects your speech. So you kind of manage more or less by the clock.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, I'll do the biggest tasks, the most important things when I have the most energy, and I'll rest up before that, yeah. So I plan ahead.
Yeah. We had another question that was submitted, and then I'll go to Laurie, because I see we have a question in the audience. And I think this is for you, Dr. Oguh. It's, how can I get a diagnosis of my specific ataxia? And that's from Lee. And then Terrence wants to know, is there an ataxia endorsement for neurologists?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's an ataxia endorsement except for what the National Ataxia Foundation does in terms of the clinics and who is on that website. I do need to get on that website. I need to fill that form out. But yeah, it's just getting on that list of providers. And the National Ataxia Foundation does an excellent job of seeking providers out. So if they hear from a patient, I have this provider, she's excellent, or he's excellent with my care, they try to get them on that list. So that's hopefully going to grow over time. Then what's the first question?
And so then it was also, how do I get a diagnosis for my specific type of attack?
So diagnosis is so important, and I think it goes 2 ways. And what I've seen, I have a family history of ataxia. I kind of know that there is a genetic ataxia in my family and I want to get diagnosed, most people will just go to the primary care or seek out a neurologist and they get tested. I think it's just based on your resources and what you have in the community. Do I like that way? No, because what tends to happen, you get this diagnosis like Kristy did, and you don't know what to do with it. And the person who gives you the diagnosis doesn't know what to do with it. And you kind of ignore it, which is part of that grieving journey process when you get diagnosed. So finding someone in the community, as I said, through the Ataxia Foundation would probably be the best. Because what we do before you get tested, now if you are not having symptoms, there is a whole pre-symptomatic ataxia pathway where you have to see a psychologist, you see a genetic counselor, so that we make sure that whether you're positive or negative, we're able to support you for that diagnosis. So that's what we call the pre-symptomatic pathway. Now, if you are symptomatic and having symptoms, seeing a neurologist, if that's the only thing you could do, is seeing a neurologist or seeing an ataxia and DUS specialist, and having that conversation. I can support you through a genetic counselor, I can support you through a psychologist, so that when we do get that diagnosis, we can then proceed, in terms of how I can support you best. So those are the ways you can get diagnosis, seeing a neurologist, and which is sort of the basic you should have in your community. And if you do have an ataxia and DUS physician, through the National Ataxia Foundation, that's one way. The National Ataxia Foundation has some specific tests that they can do as well, so that's a great resource as well, depending on what the ataxia. I think it becomes a little difficult or dicey when it's a late onset ataxia, there's no family history, and then that diagnosis could be a little bit more trickier because there are special tests we may need to do.
Yeah, thank you. Lori?
My sister is diagnosed with SCA type 1. My dad got her into stem cell therapy. And I am trying to get her into clinical trials so that she could be useful for others to come. And I've been told that she's not allowed to. How concrete is that?
So I probably may have a little bit of a question. So does she have a genetic diagnosis now?
Yeah, SCA type 1.
And was she the one that did the stem cell infusion, or your dad did?
My dad did back home in India.
Okay. There shouldn't be a reason for not being involved. It depends on the recruitment. If they're recruiting, there shouldn't be a reason for not being involved in some of the other the current trials that are ongoing.
I have contacted Johns Hopkins University, and one of the researchers there told me that if you have undergone stem cell therapy, then you're not eligible. And I want to make sure is that universal.
So that could be universal. Now, if it's your sister that hasn't had any stem cells, so there shouldn't be no reason why she should not be involved in trial. Now, your dad, yes, I think there is some exclusion criteria for stem cell research. And it's really just based on how clinical research is done. If you have any external factors, they usually exclude you, because with research, they're looking for one specific type of patient, which is not how we deal with ataxia in the real world, but they're looking for one specific profile of patients. So I would say, yes, that could be universal in a lot of the clinical trials, is excluding patients if they have stem cell infusions. No.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room? Laurie, we have a question up front.
I don't have a question, but I just want to applaud you for your bravery, for sharing your story with all of us, because it's really difficult to do that. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
And actually, folks online agree as well. So Amy wrote, thank you for sharing your story, Kristy. And Maria wrote, I loved the speech and the video, very inspiring. Maria also wants to know, what could be a message for outsiders that ignore the existence of ataxia? What do you think about that? I have some thoughts on that, but I want to volley it to you.
I don't know. I often say ignore the naysayers, but I think that's difficult in our society, right? When everybody is naysaying. I always say, think about today, because thinking about the future or even thinking about others increases your anxiety. You can't live with anxiety on a daily basis. So I think it's easier for me to say ignore the naysayers and focus on the present, but I don't know, what would you say?
Yeah, I think focus on what you can do and what you can't, don't focus on what you can't do anymore. Just move forward, and
correct. Yeah.
People who don't get it, they
will never
don't need to be in our lives.
Yeah, exactly.
I just ignored those people. That's right.
That's true.
Cut them out.
I think one of the things that I see it as an opportunity to educate too,
that too.
People
yes.
about ataxia, right? To maybe just say to them, this is the reason that I'm walking this way, or the reason that I'm speaking this way. Really fast story, we had a family barbecue. My husband has ataxia. He has moments where he will just run out of energy and collapse on the ground. And you just need to leave him there until he comes to. And so that happened during a family barbecue. And so they had known for years that he had ataxia, but they had never witnessed the ataxia, which is a big difference. And so he literally collapsed on the ground just as he finished cooking. So I gathered everybody in the family and said, okay, it's time to eat. And they were all looking at me like, are you kidding me? Like, John is laying there, what's the matter with you? And I'm like, he's fine, he'll get up in a little bit, but let's eat while the food is hot, you know? So I think that unless you experience it yourself, you can't really understand it, right? And so I think there's a opportunity to educate in that case. So I want to thank everybody for your questions. I want to thank you again, Kristy and Dr. Oguh.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
I did make a handout. It's on the platform, the virtual platform, of tips for newly diagnosed people, things I learned, things I wish I knew sooner. So check that out. Check that out when you have time.
Thank you.
Thank you.